I was a little intimidated when I saw I'd be following Dr. Simmons. I'm not nearly as dynamic or hilarious a speaker as he is, but I only have a half an hour to occupy, and hopefully you'll find this interesting. Start things off, get your juices clicking. What weed is up here on the screen? Okay, here henbit, that's right. Beautiful little purple flower. We don't see the flower that long. It's quite remarkable. As soon as you see purple flowers, you've probably had a significant amount of seed production in that field. Okay, this weed is a little bit less common. Okay, I did hear it. This is purslane speedwell. There's a close-up. You've got these nice distinctive two-podded seed pods. Okay, and then here's another one, also in your winter annual class. Nope, it's not that. Not buttercup. This is a very young field pennycress. So one of my colleagues at Western Illinois University, Dr. Wynn Phippen, is working to develop pennycress as an oilseed crop. Would be planted at the end of your corn crop and before soybeans. And so our research farm is well infested with this particular weed now. Okay, in terms of driver weeds, these are the big ones that we have at the WIU research farm. We've got good population of waterhemp, some maristel. Dr. Roskamp managed to preserve a significant amount of common cocklebur. We're starting to get some giant ragweed, although he was quite industrious to keep that off, so we didn't become anything like the U of I's DeKalb farm, and then a significant amount of morning glory. I think these weeds represent a lot of the common weeds that people deal with in the state. Okay, but I'd like to start with my resistance story. I began at Western Illinois in 2011. I'd come from the University of Nebraska where I'd gotten to work some with some resistant water hemp, but at that time the WIU farm looked pretty clean. In 2012, during my field day, we'd made a stop and there was a bulk area where we had sprayed glyphosate and there were just a couple of plants that had survived. And so we talked about this is the fact that this is what resistance is going to look like and what you might expect. The following year in that particular block, I put corn. I had a pretty robust weed control program, and I thought I was managing things well. 2014, that same area of the farm, we put down glyphosate as a burn down. Came back with glyphosate plus warrant early post, and we had water hemp coming through that. So we followed that up with glyphosate plus Flexstar, and this is what we saw on the farm. Okay? So we knew we had a problem. We went to inter-row cultivation. Okay, 2015, across that particular block, we used glyphosate plus Optil Pro as a burn down. That did not eliminate it. It came back with glyphosate plus Flexstar mid-post. That did not eliminate it. And then I went through these emotions that perhaps some of you have experienced. This comes straight from an anger management website. Shock, disbelief, fear, guilt, grief, confusion, shame and loss, and anger. Okay? I'm shamed because I'm a weed scientist. I should know better, even though I'm interested in resistant weeds. But this is something that I think a lot of people face. How many years did it take for me to have a major problem? First one was 2012, where I had a couple of survivors. Okay? By 2015, that field was just a mess. Okay? So this is something that happens really, really quickly. This was a picture I took in 2014 in Adams County. Adams County's had water hemp problems for years, but when I looked at it, I wondered if the cure was worse than the problem. These beans look more hammered than what the water hemp did. Okay, so that's a county where PPO resistance has been a major issue. They must have really jacked up the rate of cobra that was used on this field. Okay, this is data from Aaron Hager's Corn and Soybean Classics presentation a year ago in January. It shows the chart. So over the last 5 years, we've pretty much filled in the state of Illinois with water hemp that's resistant to glyphosate. And we know in the state that we have resistance to 5 different modes of action. ALS was the first one back along with the triazines in the early 1990s, that followed with the PPOs in the early 2000s, then glyphosate the mid-2000s, and HPPD later in that decade. And the aspect of his talk that concerned me most was this particular figure. So of the fields that were sampled in 2014, they had 295 fields. 52% of those were resistant to both glyphosate and PPO inhibitors. Okay? So that tells us that where we've got a problem with one, we've got over a 50% chance that we've got a problem with the second one. During the fall of 2015, I had the opportunity to attend kind of a roundtable of a bunch of weed scientists. They came from the South and the Midwest, and PPO resistance really dominated the conversation. And after my experience this summer at the WIU Farm, where we were unable to control a number of our water hemp plants with PPO, I think it's something that we should think about. Okay, this is some data from one of Brian Young's students at Southern Illinois University. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this particular chart. What they wanted to look at was how do PPO-resistant water hemp plants respond to soil-applied PPO herbicides. Okay, so up here we've got 3 frames. They looked at a 1/10 of an X rate. They looked at 3/10 of an X rate, and then they looked at a 1X rate. Okay, over here they have relative emergence, so how did the weeds emerge relative to where they didn't have any PPO. The gray bars represent resistant water hemp populations. The black bars represent susceptible populations. Then we also have different herbicides. We've got fomosafen, sulfentrazone, fomosafen plus S-metolachlor, and flumioxazin. Okay, so as you look at this chart, how well did these PPO herbicides do at controlling the resistant water hemp at a 1/10 of an X rate? These were both over 100%. It came up just as well as it did where there was no herbicide applied. Okay, where you had the S-metolachlor, it knocked it back a bit. Flumioxazin did better too. Okay, we still saw some emergence even with the susceptible, so it tells us that this rate is just marginal. Okay, if we go up to 3/10 of an X rate, still with fomosafen and sulfentrazone, what do you see? It's close to 100%. Okay, better control with flumioxazin. By the time we get to 1X rate, we're still seeing quite a bit of emergence. So I'd like you to think about this. What is the selection for PPO resistance in soybean fields in Illinois? Low, medium, or high? Okay, I think it's high. Let's talk about it. Okay, if you look at pre-products, how many of these go out? You've got the Authority brands or Sonic. Those all have PPO components. You've got the Valor Suite. They all have PPO components. You've got Prefix. Okay, it's got PPO component. And then you've got Sharpen, Optil, and Verdict. Okay, those are all PPOs. Okay, something doesn't work pre-emergence. What do we come back with post in soybeans? If you've got a glyphosate-resistant field, you're going to rely on Cobra, Blazer, the FlexStar Suite, or perhaps Cadet. Okay, what are all of those? PPOs. So many of our soybean fields, how many PPOs are they seeing a year? 2. Okay, do the pre's still work pretty well? Okay, in the majority of cases, yes, but are they always going to work for us? That's what we need to think about. Herbicides have a half-life. This should be something that's pretty familiar to you. After X number of days, half of that herbicide has degraded, typically through microbial activity, and then it goes through a slower, and I shouldn't say, the rate is still the same, half every X number of days. Over here I have some of our most widely used PPOs and the published half-life from the herbicide handbook. Okay, so flumioxazin and saflufenicil are in that 2 to 3 week range. Sulfentrazone and fomosafen are in the 3-month range. Okay, so some of these have a pretty long residual. Okay, but I'd like you to think about water hemp. What's the emergence pattern on water hemp? Okay, it comes up late. So this is some data that I drafted from research that had been done in Ames, Iowa, where they planted X number of water hemp seeds. They'd come back every week and they'd count how many emerged. So this is a synopsis of their emergence. This 0 is April 24th. A little bit colder there, so we'd probably figure April 17th for most of Illinois, at least central and southern. And then it really didn't peak until 60 days later, so you're looking at the end of June by the time you get all those water hemp up. Okay, when do we apply our pre-PPO herbicides? Okay, if we're planting timely, those are going to be applied in late April or early May. Okay, if we go back here and we think especially about flumioxacin and saflufenicil, by the time I get to late June, what fraction of that is left? Okay, we're going to have an eighth probably of what's there. So is an eighth of a rate going to stop water hemp that's coming up here at the end of June? It's not. So does that enable us, when you superimpose these, we've got low herbicide concentrations in the soil versus we're still getting emergence. Is this acting as a selection pressure to find those individuals that have some level? It really is. What might we expect to see over the next few years? The authors of this paper were very careful to comment that this does not mean that fomosafen and sulfentrazone are always the ones that PPO-resistant biotypes are going to be most resistant to. It can be any of them. But I expect that what we saw here will shift over to here. And if we keep using PPOs the way we are, eventually we'll end up over here. Okay? So we're just going to keep shifting to the right. The challenge is, what are our options? And this was kind of the disappointing thing to me at that meeting of weed scientists. Everybody around the table felt that PPO resistance was a huge concern, but nobody had an answer for it. So let's think about our options in Illinois. We could use metribuzin, but most of our water hemp populations come in fields where there's been atrazine used for years. And so what do we have in many of those fields? Atrazine resistance, and if it's a metabolic resistance, that's not going to help us much. Okay, ALS inhibitors. Many of our pre's are combined with ALS inhibitors. I really like them for the cocklebur on the WIU Farm. But we already have site of action resistance in most water hemp populations. We're relying very heavily on the long-chain fatty acid synthesis, so the duals, the warrants, outlooks, and zidua. These are being used in both corn and soybean, so we're putting intense pressure on that, but right now, this is probably our best combination with the PPOs. Okay, and then you've got the microtubule root inhibitors, so the prowls and the treflans. Treflan, of course, requires tillage. Some years in my trials, prowl is the best treatment. Some years it's the worst treatment. I haven't figured that particular chemistry out. Okay? So there's no real easy answer on this list. Okay, so how should these pre-PPOs be used? At this point, we're not going to stop resistance, but hopefully we can delay it. Use full rates. That way we're extending that high dose, so we're going to eliminate more of the water hemp population. Apply those as close to the time of planting as possible. I'm going to share a little bit of data on that. That's been a joint project across WIU, SIU, and the U of I. Use it as part of a herbicide premix or tank mix, and then follow it up when the weeds are small with an effective post control, so we eliminate that seed production back into the soil. Okay, so this is some data that's combined over a number of site years. This was a study that Aaron Hager, Brian Young, and I did together. We looked at 3 application times for, used Authority XL and Valor XLT. We looked at it in the fall, early pre-plant, and then pre-emergence. Okay, then we evaluated water hemp control at planting and then 4 weeks after planting. Okay, where you use it pre-emergence or right at that time of planting, you can see we've got a much greater suppression of water hemp when it's time for us to apply that post 3 or 4 weeks after. Okay, that makes sense, but this is my reason why we want to apply it sooner. If we're applying that in the fall, is 70% control still nice? I think that's reasonable, but 30% of water hemp can still be a tremendous number of water hemp plants to have to control. Okay, the other combination that we tried to look at is we looked at rates, and one of the thinking that we explored was if we put a split rate, so you put half of your pre down early pre-plant and you come back with half of it pre, is that going to be better off than putting it all in one dose? And if you look at this, the trend says no, it's not. Okay, so you're better off to use all your herbicide at one time. Okay, so at pre-emergence or just a week before pre-plant, Full dose would be the optimum for using that PPO herbicide. Okay, shifting topics just a little bit. The 2015 North Central Weed Science Society meeting that was held in December, paper number 90 was titled Application Timing Effects on a Novel 5-Way Resistant Population of Water Hemp. Evans et al. From the University of Illinois. So we have a 5-way population now in the state of Illinois. Okay, we're joining Missouri and Iowa. Both of those have claimed it. This little purple dot up here in northwest Missouri is one, and they're sampling that they identified a 5-way resistant population. Okay, so we're stacking those up. Okay, I'd like to think, so we've talked about soybeans. Weed control doesn't seem to be as big an issue in corn, but I think we need to think about it. Are we doing the same thing with the HPPD inhibitors in corn that we're doing in soybeans? I don't think to the same extent that the PPOs, but if we look at how many acres in the state see either mesotrione or isoxaflutol? Okay, and if we think about post combinations, mesotrione, timbotrione, and topramezone are a significant number of those. Okay, so are we abusing the HPPD inhibitors in the same way? The unfortunate response is we don't have many other options to use. Okay, a few years ago I had the opportunity to share the 2,4-D resistant water hemp story from Nebraska. In 2009, while I was an extension specialist there, I received a call from a producer of little blue stem. He had a couple of fields that had been established in warm season grass production back in the late 1990s. They'd applied 2,4-D a couple times that year and then picloram. And when I came out, this was what the water hemp looked like in the field. So as a weed scientist, I was extremely excited. This was going to be my big break and become a famous weed scientist. And as I inquired about their practices, it seemed pretty reasonable. They did a controlled burn in the spring. They came back with a pre of atrazine plus esmetolachlor and 2,4-D, and then they came back with a second application of 2,4-D. Okay, how many modes of action did he have? He had 3 that should have been effective. Okay, plus he was using fire. So he was using different things. Okay, but he did the same thing for about 13 years. What did Mother Nature do? She figured out a way around that. Okay, so this was some of our early greenhouse work. You can see the 2,4-D dose here across the bottom in fluid ounces. Susceptible population was pretty much completely controlled by a pint, but you could see our resistant population was going strong. Water hemp injury after the 2,4-D application in the field. So this is 32 quarts per acre at 7 days after treatment. It looked like we were having an effect. By the time we came back 28 days later, that effect was disappearing. And when we did biomass at the end of the season, it didn't matter if the plot had received 2,4-D or it didn't. The plants were the same size. Okay. Some subsequent work on this population suggests that the resistance is most likely metabolism-based, just like the HPPD resistance in Illinois. This particular population is resistant also to the triazines and the ALS inhibitors. Fortunately, it's still susceptible to glyphosate and glufosinate. We saw some reduced sensitivity to some synthetic auxins, so picloram, aminopyrrolid, and aminocyclopyrrochlor. All were not as effective. Dicamba was kind of a hard one to read, but it was susceptible to some of the other options. Okay, so this is a 3-way resistant population. Okay, so in my teaching, when I get dry, I have people stand up, so if you need a stand-up break, this is your comic relief. This is probably what we all wish we could do with the resistance problem. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Okay, Palmer amaranth. So in Illinois, these are the maps from January of last year. Orange is glyphosate resistant. So across the middle section of the state, our most productive farmland, we have quite a bit of glyphosate resistant palmer, at least present, not in large numbers. The big concern out of the researchers in the southern United States is they are strongly suspecting PPO resistance in their population down there. Okay? So we talked about how we're using PPOs as our stopgap measure right now for water hemp. They've been doing the same thing with Palmer, but it looks like it may be breaking. This was a picture that was sent to me by a producer when I was in the University of Nebraska, Palmer amaranth that was growing at his farm site. And the comment from my colleagues in the south is the difference between water hemp and Palmer amaranth. A water hemp field that's been infested you can combine. A Palmer amaranth field you just walk away. And the reason is because the stalks on these get so huge it's just impossible for the combine to cut through it. Okay, so that's why we really don't want Palmer amaranth. Okay, here's your next trivia. What caused this particular symptomology in soybeans? Any thoughts? Imagine a number of you saw something similar to it this year. The orange shirt. Okay, so the soybean came up okay under corn stubble. It didn't where there wasn't. Okay, let me give you another picture. What do you see on these little bean seedlings? Pardon? Yep, it is sulfentrazone. Okay, so this is a field. We planted it. We came back. We applied sulfentrazone plus dual was our combination. It had been wetter than it probably should have been when we planted, but we were anxious to get it in because it was a planting date study. We had a big rainstorm. It washed that herbicide right into the rows as it was coming up, and this is what we saw. So this is the risk with PPOs applying at pre, so that week before planting may be the sweet spot for that. Okay, so right now we're all feeling like we need a silver bullet. This was an actual car that tried to break a land speed record back in the 1920s. But the unfortunate thing is there is no silver bullet on the horizon. Okay, one thing that has been anxiously awaited are Enlist and dicamba. I'd like to talk about Enlist just a little bit. So there's both corn and soybean versions. The soybean versions include resistance to 2,4-D, it's metabolism-based, glyphosate and glufosinate, and there's an Enlist E3 that has a different glyphosate than the trait than the one that we've been using in the past. Okay, developed by Dow AgroSciences. The trait was approved in September of 2014, and the EPA approved the herbicide that same fall. There was some stewarded corn in 2015 and seed production in 2015. And then there's this new companion herbicide, Enlist Duo, that they've spent a significant amount of resources to develop to answer some of the environmental problems. Okay, the challenge with this is that there was a lawsuit filed by pro-environment, anti-agriculture groups in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. Dow AgroSciences says it was the same day that it was announced that the trait had been deregulated in Washington. Okay. Thanksgiving present for Dow AgroSciences. The EPA on November 25th revoked the label for that particular herbicide. Okay, so without the herbicide, the trait can't be used, and Dow is still waiting for approval from China with their unpredictable regulatory system. Okay, why did this happen? The EPA required Dow to take steps that had never been taken before in registering a product. So there was a diagram on the label that showed you had to protect sensitive downwind areas with a minimum 30-foot buffer. That 30-foot buffer was based on wind tunnel trials that had been conducted. They had to list specific pressures and nozzles that could be used with the product. And there are tank mix limitations, so in order to tank mix even an adjuvant, it has to be approved through a series of wind tunnel tests. And so there was a website set up to do that. And there were very rigorous herbicide-resistant management protocols that the user of Enlist Duo was to use. Okay, so why did the EPA revoke this landmark registration. The perspective of the people from Dow AgriSciences who met with a number of weed scientists and said we could talk about it was what the environmentalist groups have done in their lawsuit. There are two laws that are at conflict, and essentially we've seen a head-on collision from them. First is FIFRA, which in agriculture we're very familiar with, where if a pesticide can be demonstrated to have a reasonable certainty of no harm, and there's a strong enough benefit to it that outweighs the risk, it can be approved. Okay, the Endangered Species Act is less flexible. This is language from a federal website. It requires federal agencies to ensure that any action they authorize, fund, or carry out will not likely jeopardize the continued existence of any listed species or destroy or adversely modify any critical habitat for those species. Okay, are there endangered species in Illinois? There are. Okay, these are 3 plant species that occur in agriculture areas. You've got your prairie bush clover right here, decurrent false aster, and eastern prairie fringed orchid. Have any of you ever seen these plants? Okay, I have not. So the way that this lawsuit has been pitted is that environmentalist groups are concerned about these endangered species, and so they do not want Enlist Duo to be applied any place where it could affect the endangered species. Okay, so when they looked at a map, there were all but 2 counties in the state of Illinois that had some endangered species in it. Okay, so could they do that on a county-by-county basis? The answer is no, that would kill the technology. Okay, so what would be a practical solution? If you identify fields where there may be endangered species and just not apply the technology in that field, right? Okay, but if you were a regulator, what's your fear if you tell someone that there's an endangered species in their field? Probably going to be along a woodlands or fence row. Could they come in with their cultivator and eliminate that endangered species? Okay, so that's the regulatory framework. So they know where these are. They list it by counties, but they don't release within the counties where the species are. Okay, so the one other thing that's kind of played into this, many of you have probably heard of Pesticide Synergy. A great example is atrazine plus Callisto. So if you put on 0.2 of a pound of atrazine, maybe you'll get 30% control. An ounce of mesotrione by itself, maybe 30% control. Put the 2 of them together, we'd expect 60, but in actuality we get 90. So that's synergy. Okay, big chemical companies started playing a patent game with synergy in which they would mix product A and mix product B together, and if it looked like it was a little bit better, then they would apply for a synergy patent. There was not a high bar of data that had to be required. Okay, so there is a synergy patent out there claiming that 2,4-D and glyphosate are synergized by each other. I think most of us would say that that's not the case. So if company B wants to make a premix, they have to pay royalties to company A. So if you're company A, are you going to want to get caught in a situation where you have to pay company B and it's your product? The answer is no. So they played this game where there's hundreds of patents filed for synergy. Okay, the EPA came across one of these patents as part of the court proceedings, and their big question is if there is synergy between 2,4-D and glyphosate, how will that affect endangered species? Okay, and so the thinking is that's probably what caused them to withdraw the registration of Enlist Duo. Okay, so potential solutions, maybe the EPA will come back and reinstate Enlist Duo with a larger buffer area. But the perspective is the EPA doesn't want to lose a lawsuit to the environmental groups because that limits their freedom to operate, so they have to craft this very carefully. Okay, I'm wondering, this is Mark Bernard's wonder, is this conundrum delaying the commercialization of Roundup Extend? So is the EPA sitting on this label because they know they're going to have the same problem with this that they have with the Enlist Duo, so they want to figure Enlist Duo out? Okay, and the gut check that I had as we sat in this meeting was, will anti-pesticide groups employ this strategy to affect other pesticide or technology registrations? How often do herbicides have to be re-registered? Every 15 years. What herbicide is currently going under re-registration? It's glyphosate. Okay? If the environmentalist groups figure out a ploy that works, are they going to try to play that again? And the answer is yes. So this is something that I think is concerning, but I wanted to give you that perspective on it. Okay, some other new technologies. Got Liberty Link, Bolt soybeans. Some of you may have heard of. These are going to be resistant to high levels of sulfonylureas. Got Roundup Extend 2, Balanced GT beans, MGI soybeans are all coming. This will be my final slide. How many of you have heard of Haas weed management before? This was a phrase coined by Stephen Powles out of Australia. It stands for herbicide-only syndrome. Okay? So if we think about what we've got coming down the pike, what are we looking forward to? It's other herbicides. But if we think about it in concept of what we've talked about today, I'm going to ask, is it management short-sightedness? We're just going to be using the same herbicides in corn and soybeans. So what does that do to our selection pressure? It really ramps it up. Okay, I like herbicides. I weeded a couple-acre field as a kid, and I decided that herbicides were God's answer to make life more pleasant. But I think we've really got to think about things outside of herbicide in our weed management so that we can use that as a resource for the long term. Thanks. Are there any questions I could possibly answer? Enjoy the rest of your conference.